Hi, everyone. I'm Chinkle, partner at Mantrox, and I'm thrilled to be your host today. Welcome to our webinar on backlog management, a key element of Agile software development. In this session, we'll explore key strategies for backlog refinement, best practices, and practical tips from our experienced panel on how to optimize your backlog management process. Let's get started by getting to know our panelists. Let's start with you first, Jerry.
Thank you. Yeah, my name is Jerry Doucette. I'm an enterprise business agility coach. I'm the founder of Evolutionize, which is a business improvement organization. I started my career as a software developer using the ancient languages of Fortran and COBOL and Pascal and WAP4. But most recently, I've been spending most of my time training, coaching, and certifying people. So I've been working with dozens of organizations, hundreds of teams, and literally thousands of people around the globe in learning agility practices and approaches, and also in learning collaborative service delivery techniques.
Great.
Thank you.
Nice to have you here, Jerry. Raghunath?
Hey, so I have got around 25 years of experience working with various large MNCs, and most of my career went into, guiding the teams in various positions like a, Scrum Master or project lead or technical manager, and now at Mantrax as a project delivery manager and all those things. So I got more than 20 years of experience in driving the teams, and more often we do the same mistakes, and that's where we are to discuss what people do repeatedly and how can we improve to make sure we are a success in an agile world. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Raghunath. And our last panelist is Kalyan Chatterjee, also from Mantrax. Kalyan, over to you for a quick intro.
I am Kalyan, so I oversee project delivery alongside Ranganath. I come from a software engineering background like Ranganath as well. And I have about 15 years of experience working in various positions, from a junior developer to a technical lead to a project manager to a delivery lead. And I call myself a pragmatic agile practitioner. I'm not so deep into theory. My role is to see what works in agile and how can I use agile effectively, and that makes sense. So that's where I come from.
Thanks, Kalyan. Before we kickstart off the session, let's take a look at the agenda for today. So first, we're going to have our expert agility coach, Jerry, give us an overview on backlog refinement process. And then we're going to focus majority of the session on getting tips and advice and discussing some of the common challenges that we see in backlog management from our expert panelists, Jerry, Raghunath, and Kalyan, on how to optimize backlog management and how to look out for some common pitfalls that teams usually fall into. Jerry, I'll send it right back over to you to give a quick overview on the basics of backlog refinement so we can get started with a bit of theory.
All right. I'm wondering if the slide deck is up.
Yep. Let me pop that up again.
Perfect. Because we'll use that to sort of steer the conversation a little bit. Before we actually get started, I want to acknowledge the fact that, we talk about backlog management. We need to recognize the fact that there's a lot of work that has to happen prior to even the backlog management and refinement activities. This is a very simple diagram that shows, some of the thought patterns and processes that happen prior to this. And it's really just about making sure that the ideas that are entering our backlog, that we understand the why, that what we're going to be building is also very clear, that what we're building aligns with the vision of the product and the service that we're providing, and then also that we validate and make sure that it's going to be valuable to the customer as well as to our business. Once all of that happens, and there's a lot of conversation around that, then what we do is we create that backlog item. And what we're going to do today is talk about how do we manage those backlog items as we go through. And there's a whole series of practices. So if you can go to the next slide, the first thing we want to really address is this why. Why are we doing this? What is the purpose of backlog management? And it's really to give us this emergent ordered list of what's needed. It takes a look at all of the work that's being provided, functional, non-functional, and it really provides us with guidance on what we're going to build and or how we're going to improve that product or service. So it's giving us that guidance. It's the scope and everything that we're going to be working on. It gives us that sort of that North Star that we can aim towards. Next slide, please. The next reason to look at here is the what we're doing here. And what we're actually doing is there's a series of activities that we'll get into later on. We talk about reviewing and decomposing and defining that work so that the team understands and they can take that vision and that idea for the product or service, the features, the subsets that we're building, and we can actually turn it into something valuable that we deliver to our customer. And that includes things like descriptions and outcomes, the expectations, what the expectation is, the usability, the functionality. Also, how do we measure success? In other words, if we deliver something, how do we know it's going to provide the value that it's supposed to provide? That means that there's activities such as ranking, and there's sizing, and there's estimation. These are all activities that aren't necessarily value add to the work, but they help us manage the work so that we can be efficient in delivering it. Next slide. We talk about who does this. Primarily, if you're using a Scrum team, you'll have a product owner who will help facilitate that. If you've got a Kanban type approach, then usually you've got a service request facilitator that's taking the input. But their job really is to manage these ideas and turn it into a usable state, a consumable state, so that the team understands what the ask is and how they're going to deliver it. That means bringing in other experts where required to have conversations about the work. Next slide. Timing is an interesting one on this as well, right? This happens early and continuously. This is one of those things that I like to sort of stress as a big difference between the way traditional practices work in project management and agile practices. We do our conversations early, and we continue to have those conversations about the backlog. It needs to be an ongoing activity to make sure that our pipeline is healthy, so that we have something the team understands what's coming down the pipe and what's going to be next, but we also can adapt and pivot where required. So it requires a lot of frequent conversations and ongoing activities towards this. It is a maintenance type thing to make sure that we have what we need when we're ready to work on it. And next slide. The real outcome that we're shooting towards this is being able to provide the team with some information so that they can commit with confidence. They can look, they understand the ask, they understand what needs to be delivered, they understand the customer's expectations, they know what it should do in the other end, and they can confidently commit to that and say, yes, we can have it by this date, and this is what needs to happen. So the ongoing conversations are really about setting us up for success when we're actually building the solutions and providing it.
Okay, great. Thanks for the overview, Jerry. Maybe I'll jump in and say, how long have you been training on backlog management, and how popular is this topic with your audience?
It's not as popular as it should be. So I'm going to answer your second question first. This is something that I find often gets left behind. People are so busy, they want to get to the game. And there's this misperception too at the same time that Agile means no requirements. And it's not. It means just in time and fit for purpose. It means taking a look and evolving them as you go. So we do see some demand on this, but I find that most often the demand for this is for more mature teams. There's an initial demand initially for product owners who want to learn some of the practices that we talk about this, to learn the rudimentary parts of the craft to get going. And then there's this lull where they actually do it. And that's when they start realizing, oh, there's a lot more to backlog management than what actually, we expect. So they start getting into this. They start having the problems. I've seen both sides of the coin here. I've seen some situations where teams actually overburdened because there's too much work because they hadn't, planned it enough, and they get overloaded and the backlog wasn't organized properly. But I've actually seen teams starved where their work wasn't in a ready state. There's a lot of conversations happening and the team was literally waiting for answers because they were waiting for, a decision to be made or something like that. So the demand fluctuates, but I do find initially it's upfront people asking for product ownership roles, then it drops. And then again, later when teams mature, they realize that if they really want to go faster, this is a critical part of that.
Yeah, I would think that, backlog would be one of those top things that you would always want to go through, because I haven't worked on a project where there hasn't been a backlog or a wish list, or, or the confusing the backlog with the wish list, right? So of course I would think it's, super important to kind of address this up front. Let's get into some of the other common questions that we get. One thing I often hear is that how do we prevent the backlog from getting lost? This happens often. We're working on something interesting, some new idea comes up, and then there are always project constraints, right? So we put something on the backlog, and then how do we make sure that doesn't get lost? What is the process to kind of make sure it's reviewed and it ends up somewhere and there's continuity with that item? I'll ask you to jump in here.
Yeah, I was going to say I can take that one. So in reality, what happens is you're working on a project on a finite. Every project has some kind of a budget, right, or time constraint. Somebody comes up with this great idea. You don't want to inhibit their enthusiasm. You said, okay, you know what? Let's backlog it for now and we'll address it. But what happens is it keeps coming, and the backlog grows and it's out of bounds, right? So I think the short answer is keep the backlog short, right? But in reality, it's very hard to do. So what I think should be done, and again, this is again from a pragmatic agile practitioner's point of view, is you need to keep the haystack of bad ideas, need to avoid the haystack of bad idea scenario, right? So if you are getting an idea that you know that this is not going to be a value add, or it's not going to be something that the project sponsor would even entertain, I would not even add it into the backlog. Only add items into the backlog that you see has a business objective and can be delivered within the budget and the time constraint. And if there are items in the backlog that you are inheriting, if you see the items that you'll never do, delete those items. Keep it small and keep it like manageable and roll with that. I don't know if anybody else would like to jump in there.
Okay. Great. Thanks, Kalyan. Let's go for another question. One thing I often hear is that, teams are very busy completing the current sprint, right? They're usually, you got 2 weeks in most cases. There's a tight deadline. There's daily stand-ups. So how do teams find time to work on managing the backlog, grooming, estimating, and paying attention to the growing backlog in most cases? Maybe I'll let you take it on this one.
Yeah, sure. So, as a human psychology, unless you know the importance, you won't allocate time. Okay. So what is important for the team is, making sure their committed stories are done. That's first priority. And what they don't see is if they don't make their backlog ready for the next sprint, they are going to fail the next sprint. And while concentrating here, they might be failing tomorrow. So both are important. Concentrating on the current sprint work as well as concentrating on the upcoming sprints work. So first thing is they should feel that need. And then if you don't do that, there are 3 things which can happen. You have a failed estimate, you didn't estimate it properly. You probably have a spillover because your story is not correctly written or you probably might have a rework. So all this can be prevented if they have given sufficient attention in the grooming. And that is the first goal, make sure that you are paying sufficient attention in the grooming. Second, at least have 2 sprints worth of backlog ready for dev state. When we say ready for dev state, all those things are clear. There's no ifs and buts, there is no ambiguity, and there is a clear picture for at least for the senior people that what they need to know, and they can, when they go to the planning meeting, it should be a no-brainer for them to say, okay, it's a medium, large, small, X pointer, Y points, and all those things. So those things, if they have to happen, they need to spend time in the current sprint for the upcoming sprints, and there is no choice. But at the same time, teams are busy. You have a stand-up, you have a review, you have a demo, you have a bug call, whatnot. But at the same time, even this grooming, allocating time for this grooming is also really important. So what they have to figure out is what is the time in the sprint where they are slightly free, which is probably your current sprint dev work is complete and there is a transitioning to the QA. So during that time, they have to allocate time and specifically sit with the product owners, stakeholders, and have that grooming. So unless if you do that, you're going to probably fail in the sprint.
Okay, some great tips.
Yeah, and also as Jerry mentioned in one of the calls, at least we should spend around 10% of the time for grooming. That's it, Chingar. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, no, sounds like it's a great advice. Also, you're also saying let's make it manageable. You're not going to figure out the entire backlog, right? You might have enough backlogs for 3 or 4 sprints, right? Focus on the next 2 sprints, right? At least so you have, make it manageable, which I think it's a solid framework to kind of go by. Okay, thanks, Raghunath. So, the principles of backlog management, what to do it, how to do it, they seem relatively straightforward, but I know it's a topic that people struggle with. So what are some of the common pitfalls or mistakes that project teams don't think about or don't give enough consideration to when they're planning their backlog management activities? And that kind of leads them into trouble or prevents them from actually doing it properly. Jerry, I'm sure you've seen many examples of this, so maybe I'll let you take a stab at this question.
Yeah, and it's funny because I think you're completely right. When you take a look at the techniques, they're pretty straightforward. The tools and the techniques that I teach in my classes, they're very simple to pick up and to actually apply, but it's the things that get missed that often cause the problems. And that I think that's really where we're getting at here. What I find most often is that, when people are doing backlog management activities, they're quite often not considering their capacity constraints. They're busy doing estimation on effort, but they're not actually considering what their constraint is on the capacity. They're also not looking at things like dependencies. So in other words, if I build this, what other things are going to be affected, both upstream and downstream? So in other words, I don't see a lot of teams doing what I call dependency maps, where they say, who do I depend on and who depends on me? And how does all of that work integrate together? So when we're doing estimates, we fail to take into account those types of things, because that's quite often where the bottlenecks are. And that's where we get hung up and we can't get things done and we end up waiting for things. And the other things that they miss quite often are these skills gaps. So in other words, we think we can do it, but we underestimate the amount of time or effort it'll take. One of the teams that I worked with years ago at a prior company that I was at, they were on the hook specifically to do performance testing. And they kept missing the mark on this. They thought performance testing was pretty straightforward, but they didn't have a performance testing expert on the team. So they always underestimated the amount of effort that it took, because there's more to it than they understood. So they just didn't understand that part of the domain. So a lot of these types of things, even though it's simple to estimate or that, it can cause problems when you start prioritizing your work, when you start looking at what you can deliver, and when you start making commitments.
Right. Along the same lines, not performing the backlog activities correctly and looking at the correct factors like capacity planning, skill sets, etc. I imagine a common theme is also just putting everything into the backlog, right? Here's an idea from, various stakeholders, the project team, the end users, and what can be done to prevent the backlog from maybe overloading? Kalyan, do you see this often in your projects and day-to-day management? Sorry, you're on mute, Kalyan.
Oh, sorry about that. Yeah, in a real world scenario, you'll see that the backlog could be like really large and we cannot avoid it, right? That's the reality. I would like to say that, okay, let's put a max number of items that can stay in the backlog, but to enforce that is like really, really difficult, right? So what can we do to make it more manageable, right? So I think some of the things that we can do, and if anybody else would like to jump in here, feel free. But I would say that divide and conquer, create like some kind of a hierarchy of strategies, right? And you have 1 quarter ahead of you, and you can select the number of epics that you can work on and refine the backlog for those epics only, right? And then tackle those ones in the next sprints that you're planning for. And the other things that you can also do is like you group related stories into epics. Like if you see that there is lots of items in your backlog that might fall into an epic, try to group them, organize them as better as you can, and define like an MVP to concentrate on a particular epic that are essential for your project requirements, meets the business objectives, and can also be, as Jerry mentioned, that it has no skills gap, can be actually achieved and satisfies like the time constraints.
Okay, great. So say a project team and a Scrum Master is getting very good at the backlog management, and they are doing it regularly. They're allocating the 10% that Jerry, you mentioned, Ranganatha, that you enforced. They're planning the 2-week sprint. Where is the backlog managed in terms of communication? Who are you sharing it with? Who should you share it with? And how often should you share it with to make sure there's enough visibility, it's not growing too big, it's manageable, and it's not really getting out of hand? Rangnath, do you have any thoughts on terms of who should you be sharing the backlog with and what frequency, and the importance of this activity?
Sure. I think the product owner and the team, definitely, they are the ones who are, closely working with the backlog. They probably are considered as main key holders of the backlog. But at the same time, you need to think of the people who are like what we call as the stakeholders. So they are also important. Like, why stakeholders? So I'm not concentrating on the team because, it's important. Like, there's no choice for them to escape from the backlog management and all this. But at the same time, the stakeholders also should be taken into consideration. When we say stakeholders, who are there, like the project sponsors or the people who are actually, going to, the paying us for developing this project. And why that is important, because these project sponsors, they are putting their money, they probably would have committed something to the customers, right? And their commitment and their reputation is at stake if a project is not delivered. And it's not that, you give a deadline and, you come back and expect things should fall in place. So it's very important for them to see, and it's very important for us to share this backlog and everything to them so that they can see what's happening, how we are progressing, and have their say in the backlog grooming, like grooming in the prioritization, because they're closer to the customers. So if I am a technical person, I'll probably be more interested in doing unit testing, making the things more solid, etc. Some fine, new technology I want to bring in, but that's not adding end user value. But these guys, if they know that, if this is important for the customer, they can, bump up the priority. So it's very important for the stakeholders to have a close look on the project, and you need to have a regular meetings with them and share your, feedback with them. And they should be able to prioritize stories within the backlog based on what they see when the product goes at one sprint is over and one project is rolled out. They see the feedback right away before us. So they are the first one to see the feedback from the customers. So they know what is going to work, what is going to give them a big bang for the buck. And that's why it's important for the project stakeholders to have a very good access via Jira or say from the project reports or anything, and they should be able to see the project backlog.
Okay, great. In practice, how often have you engaged the entire stakeholders? Like once a month, once a quarter? Like I know every project is different, so it's hard to kind of general answer, but what have you found in
Okay, sure. So generally, it's like, I'll tell you scenarios where, whenever there's a quarter, right, you need to have quarterly shareholder updates, right? You need to give your quarterly updates to the shareholders. So definitely once in a quarter, just before your quarterly earnings call, they come back and see where their investment went, how far are they, and like what project, let's say you rolled out a feature, how was the feedback, how was the revenue generated, how many users got added. So all those things we need to share with them. And they will also know, and we also need to share because we have access to the databases and all those things. So once in a quarter, just before the earnings calls, it's definitely is a must for them. Or when a project is scheduled into various themes like MVP1, MVP2, MVP3. So just before an MVP starts and one MVP ends, we need to meet with them. And basically it's like definitely like not every week I would say, but 1 month to 3 months, it can be something, but not more than 3 months. It's like 1 month and 3 months. It's based on their availability, and we need to keep the things in a crisp manner so that they probably are very busy people. Like they need to go back with this report to the salespeople. You know what, this feature is coming. You know what, this much revenue is generated for the CEO level people. So it should be tailor-made. The report should be tailor-made so that when they go to the salespeople, they can say that what, this feature is going to live next sprint or next quarter, and you can put it in your next pamphlet like yeah, this is coming live, and get more people. So like that.
Okay, great. So I think just it sounds like it's obviously it's tailored for probably, but look, some of the key things you mentioned. Look out for the MVP release. Look at the next product release. Look at the project reporting schedule, whether it's quarterly or etc., and kind of fit it in there on a regular occurrence. So great feedback. So again, I as I'm listening to the experts and the theory, it's I don't want to make it simple, but it does seem fairly straightforward. And practice is not there. The regular cadence is not there. So even after providing training, Jerry, maybe this is more a question maybe that you could take on. What is the number one thing that project teams really struggle with? Even after they've gone through the training of basics of backlog refinement, they know the tools, they've worked with you for several sessions, and they still can't seem to kind of get that one thing, or they still struggle with the practice.
Yeah, it really comes down to discipline. Like we get paid as teams to deliver value and to deliver things, and backlog management isn't seen as part of that. It's often seen as a separate part. It's often seen as overhead, and teams get into this practice very, very quickly because they're on the gun and they're on the hook to deliver. So they're measured on what they deliver. Backlog management is part of that pipeline, and it's not seen as part of that. So therefore, it often gets forgotten, or it gets put behind, or it gets deprioritized. So what ends up happening is they end up having poor hygiene practices, and it's going back to those practices and just making sure that there's a discipline to actually do it, to have those conversations, and to understand that you do need to split, you do need to estimate, you do need to prioritize. The estimations in that, they don't have to be heavy. Some teams then make the opposite mistake, and I've seen that, where they spend so much time estimating or splitting to such small pieces that it doesn't really provide much value. But there are some very specific practices that you should put into play, and you should always come back to those basics. There's a lot of activities. Thanks. This is perfect. Yeah, there's a lot of activities that you need to be doing, and it's forgetting even some of these, or forgetting the order of them, or not doing them on a consistent, frequent basis that really gets teams into trouble. Like learn proper writing techniques so that there's a consistency in what you're applying. Make sure that there's acceptance tests. So in other words, what's the outcome look like? Make sure those estimates are done to an appropriate level. I mentioned estimation. One of the teams I worked with years ago, they wanted to estimate and break pieces down into 15-minute chunks, which is far too much for them to manage. I let them try it. They learned very quickly that was too much overhead. So you have to find that sweet spot, but it's the consistency of doing these practices. And we've got some other ones here, just making sure risks are highlighted, like the bottlenecks, the dependencies, all of those types of things. I think there's another page of them too. Yeah, like there's lots of stuff. And I've got a couple of slides actually. If we've got a couple of minutes, we can take a look at some of these because I've just highlighted some of them here. What we're going to talk about here, these are the fundamentals that people know, but they forget to do because they forget to go back to it. One of them is about just good hygiene. It's about making sure that those requirements are in a usable state, so they're consumable by the team. One technique is to use, actually write them in the format of user stories. Now, I want to be absolutely clear on this. User stories are probably the most popular way to write requirements using an agile type approach, but they're not the only one. But the idea here really is about clarifying things. And if you take a look at this, we're taking a look at the role, the action, and the benefit, just so that teams, when they build something, can understand what that is. So if you advance just a little bit, you'll get an example here. And what we're really looking at is just providing who is it that needs that? What are they trying to do? And why is it important for them? This is clear and is providing clarification to the team. So a customer should be able to read any requirement and understand what the ask is and give the thumbs up, just as the team should be able to do that too. But the key here, and this is something that gets forgotten, this isn't the end. This is just the beginning. It's an invitation to a bigger conversation about what you're building. So there's other techniques as well. One of the techniques I like to add, if you can just go back there really quickly, one of the techniques I always like to add is that second statement. That way, the business metric. This helps us then tie it back to, okay, so we've talked about why it's important to the customer. Let's talk about why it's important to us and to our business as well. That's a bonus item that I put in there sometimes. All right. There's other practices too, like acceptance tests I mentioned a little bit earlier. These are just about making sure that what you're building sort of passes those goalposts. Sometimes you'll hear them called acceptance criteria, conditions of satisfaction. It really is just about making sure that if you build something, it does what is expected or intended. This is the beautiful spot that sort of ties into user experience and customer experience. You want to make sure that when you say you build something, that it actually does what's intended. This becomes the goalpost that the teams can aim towards. So this is the sweet spot where business and IT can talk together and talk the same language about what they expect. And hopefully this aligns with what the customer expects. That's the real goal there. Estimation techniques, I mentioned the fact that estimation, can be done. It doesn't have to be heavy. There's some really simple ones, just the eyeball guesstimation. A lot of these techniques that we've got here we'll teach in our classes, but the idea here isn't about getting complicated overly complicated in these formulas and that. I've worked with organizations that use financial modeling like number 8, and it can be very, very cumbersome to manage. A much easier approach is something like an analogy, like t-shirt sizing or affinity mapping, or even the planning poker type approaches. The key here is be consistent in how you apply it. So try one of these, figure out which one works for you. If it doesn't work, then try another. The key is to be consistent in how you do that so that the teams can have confidence when they commit to that work. Remember, that's the goal. We want them to be able to commit to that and be confident in how they do it. So there's lots of techniques. Find one that works best for you. And it doesn't, this is the key. It doesn't have to be 100%, and it won't be 100%. A lot of these models leverage the fact that as humans, we're better at relative comparison than absolute comparison. So these techniques, many of them are meant to accelerate our estimation techniques so that we get enough to get started, and then we refine that estimation as we go as part of being agile. Splitting the work is important, especially if you're using sprints. There's a lot of different splitting techniques. There's some of them that you'll see here as they appear. And the idea here is it's really about taking the work and breaking it down into more manageable chunks. And if we've got a piece of work or a feature or say a component that's going to take maybe a month, 6 weeks to build, that's a long time to commit to something. Having patterns like these to break it into more logical chunks allows you to build things but also get faster feedback from your customer. So you can focus and go deep and build some functionality. Now, quite often it means you have to stub things out. You may have to do a mock-up, but it's getting fast feedback so that you can pivot or preserve. These are some of the techniques that come from Richard Lawrence. You can find them online. I teach this in my class as well. These are some great patterns that we see. But, it's just about breaking the work into logical chunks so that the team understands, but also when you can deliver something to your customer or to your users and they can give you fast feedback. So they're not waiting for the whole thing, but again, leveraging the agility in that feedback loop. Hierarchies are usually a logical output of these splitting patterns. There's a lot of different techniques that you can use. I've provided a lot of information here with regards to many layers. Matter of fact, I would recommend that there's too many layers in that central section, but different organizations have different splitting patterns and different techniques that they use. Most of the organizations that I find use three common ones. They may have, for example, they may be a theme-based, there may be an epic and a feature and then a task. So whatever subset works best for you, but it's really, again, it's just about logically organizing the work. And teams forget about this when they're doing the work. It's really easy to get down into the weeds of the tasks and the activities. I know I've been on software development teams. I'm a very tactical person, but sometimes it's important for us to pull ourselves back out and look at the higher vision. How does what I'm doing at the tactical level really contribute towards the bigger goal and the output? And there's time constraints that are put on those as well. So we just like to call out, smaller pieces of work typically fit within more granular pieces. So we're looking at sprints and that really helps us in doing our estimation and making, firmer commitments. There's validation techniques too. I don't know whether any of you have heard of the technique called INVEST. This doesn't come from the financial services industry. It's not that kind of invest, but this is just about a litmus test. This is about making sure that what you're working on, is it something that's consumable by the team? Is it something they can deliver on? Does it provide value? Is it something the team can estimate? Is it of the right size? Is it something you can write a test on? So every time you split or every time you look at new work, new features, new functions, those sorts of things, just doing a quick litmus test of the INVEST model against it helps us validate whether or not it's in what we call the state so that we can actually start working on it. And if it's not, we need to ask questions. If there are dependencies, what are those dependencies? You remember I mentioned earlier, one of the biggest challenges that teams do is they forget about dependencies. This helps trigger that conversation. So this is just about having meaningful conversations about the work. And this is really it. This is sort of where we're trying to take it all to. We're trying to get the backlog into what we call a ready state. And there's three key things that I always try to harp on. People get tired of me saying this, but is the work clear? Does the team get it? Do they get the ask? Do they know what they're being asked? And do they know what the outcome looks like? Is it feasible? In other words, can they finish that work to the definition of done? Can they get it out the door? Do they have the tools, the techniques, the skills? Are there things that are missing? Is it feasible for them to do it within a sprint if they're using Scrum? And is it testable? So in other words, can they write a test and then can they pass that test at the end? Quite often this can be as simple as an acceptance test, but it should go more deeper than that. Sometimes they call this the definition of ready. I don't like the definition of ready that much. I find it's a useful crutch if you need it, but if you've got a healthy pipeline, and this is sort of where it brings it all together, then this is a really good place to be at. You have an understanding of the work that's coming down the pipeline. It's in a healthy state. You have good practices like we were talking about here, and the team understands it so that when they see the work, they can make a confident commitment to say, yes, we can finish this. And if they can't say that, at least they can identify what's missing so we can solve for that gap.
Okay, some great techniques there. Thanks. I'm sure there's a lot more depth than what we just kind of went through, and you know who to go to if we want to kind of learn the fundamentals of each one. I know we're kind of getting to the end, so I think it's one more question that I think is very popular that I want to get to, and I love this one because I know whether it's software development or regular project management, it always kind of comes up. What is the difference between backlog versus a wish list? And I know, that was my favorite because when I was working on a project, you would always get, even like stakeholders who are not part of the project stakeholders just come in with, I had this thought, I had this idea, can we just, add this functionality? How do you really differentiate between a backlog and a wish, and how do you manage that conversation?
Can I take a comical? Yeah, I can take a comical stab at it. So the way I envision this one is, imagine you have a stack of plates that's about to tip, right? And that adding one more plate, you're risking the entire stack from tipping. So wish list is that, like, are you going to add it and risk it, or you're not going to add it? So if you think that, yeah, this is worth it, this has business objectives that's going to satisfy, it's worth adding and taking the risk, you add it to the backlog. And otherwise, if you think that it's something that somebody, so even it could be a stakeholder, came up with, oh, this is a great idea, let's do it, click off a button and it will solve all the problems. That kind of a wish list item that the team cannot achieve, let's not add it to the stack. Let's not add it to the backlog. So that's not a backlog item. So a wish list is something that there is no way you can achieve, right? And you have to tactically handle it. Sometimes you have to be a little, pushy. Like sometimes project stakeholders say, no, this is so important, we want it. But then you have to show them, like, what's the ground reality. You cannot achieve it within the budget. You cannot achieve it within the timeline, and just don't let it make its way to the backlog. So that would be my take on this.
I'm
So
sure it's
one
again. Sorry, go ahead on
Yeah.
that.
So one technique people use is like Moscow, like, must have, should
Wow.
have, that kind.
Mhm.
So, okay, stakeholders, please add it. It's your project. You're paying for it. But yeah, put a MSOs, Moscow against each one, must have, should have, and all, and their wish list will come to the last. And that's must and should will come to the top. So in that way, you put the ball in their court only, and end of the day, they're paying for us. So
Okay.
Great. Okay, I know there's a lot more questions, but sorry, go ahead, Jerry.
I'm just going to say, Kalyan, I'm going to use that in my next class. I'll give you full credit. I love that analogy.
Okay. Thanks.
Okay, so I know I'm kind of coming to the end of our scheduled session. There are a lot more questions, but I'm kind of wrap it up. As we discussed, the process of creating a backlog item isn't just about joining on the task. It involves careful consideration of various factors, from writing clear, concise backlog items to defining acceptance criteria, to estimating efforts, to identifying dependencies, and ensuring each item, in Jerry's words and technique, a ready state for the next at least 2 sprints. Throughout our Agile journey, Jerry has also mentioned the practice of backlog refinement, writing proper items, refining them, estimating them, managing them, handling slip items, building hierarchies and validating them, and keeping a proper hygiene for this activity on an ongoing basis. I want to thank our panelists for joining. Some great tips. I know we just touched the surface of many of the techniques that Jerry teaches, so I'm looking forward to some additional sessions. And thank you. I want to thank Kalyan for also providing some practical tips on your day-to-day work.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, Vanessa and Tracy.
Thank you.
Okay.